U.S. interests in foreign places quickly led to conflict. In 1898, the U.S. declared war on Spain. You may ask why, and here are the reasons. One, Spanish ruled Cuba harshly, and Cubans wanted independence from Spain. They saw stories in the paper about what was occurring in Cuba, and it angered Americans. Of course, what they saw in newspapers wasn't entirely accurate. Newspapers were competing against one another, and in order to do so, they would use yellow journalism. And this was a popular type of news reporting in the late 1800s, and it was characterized by biased opinions, distorted truths, and sensational stories that were presented as fact. These stories were designed to grab the reader's attention so that they could sell more newspapers. And the need to sell papers led to even more fabrication or lying in competition between two of the major editors in New York City. One was Joseph Pulitzer. He was a German immigrant and the publisher of New York World. The other was William Randolph Hearst, who was a newspaper mogul, the publisher of the New York Journal. The third reason for war with Spain was the Delon Letter. This was written by Spain's ambassador to the United States. It was actually not written to the United States, but was intercepted and shared with the people of the United States, the president. And the letter insulted President McKinley. It made Americans very angry with the Spanish. The fourth reason was an attack on the USS Maine. The U.S. sent the USS Maine to observe and protect interests in Cuba, and it was in the port of Havana when it exploded. Newspapers, of course, blamed Spain. In actuality, they don't really know what happened exactly to the USS Maine, but because of yellow journalism and the reporting, Americans were quick to assume that it was malintent by the Spanish. And so, remember the Maine becomes the battle cry for the war with Spain over Cuba. Much like remember the Alamo, this cry incited Americans, got Americans hyped to fight a war with Spain. Of course, this is some of the journalism. This is the cover of New York Journal, and you can see that they're speculating how the USS Maine was destroyed. And you can also see there that they're offering a $50,000 reward for information leading to the perpetrator of the USS Maine. This was an illustration. You can see very dramatic, bodies flying everywhere. So the Spanish-American War began, and this was a conflict that happened entirely within the year 1898 between Spain and the United States. And it was the result of American intervention in the Cuban War for Independence. So essentially, Cuba wanted independence. They were resisting Spain and the imperialism of the Spanish. And the United States decided to help them out. So McKinley had initially hoped to avoid war with Spain, but he's pressured by congressmen in both parties, Democrats and Republicans. And finally, Congress declares war against Spain. This is a picture that you see there on the left. This is Theodore Roosevelt there in the middle, kind of under the flag. And he led a group called the Rough Riders, which was a volunteer cavalry sent to Cuba to fight. It was most well known for the Battle of San Juan Hill, which was kind of a turning point in the Spanish-American War. And the Rough Riders helped to defeat Spain in Cuba, in the battle in Cuba. There was another group that was another cavalry group that were known as the Buffalo Soldiers, and this was a group of African Americans who also had a large part in winning the Battle of San Juan Hill. Secretary of State John Hay really plays up the Spanish-American War, calling it a splendid little war. Because the war was short-lived, it only lasted for really a short time. It happened all within the year 1898, and very few died in battle. Actually, more people died of disease, particularly yellow fever, than from injuries sustained in battle. At the end of the war, Cuba was free. Cuba was given its independence. Simultaneously, and actually just prior to the beginning of the battle in Cuba, the U.S. attacked a Spanish fleet in the Philippines. And this is, as you can see, in May of 1897. And this really starts the Spanish-American War. This is led by Commander George Dewey, leads a U.S. fleet into the Manila Harbor, and there's a surprise attack on the Spanish Armada that's hanging out in the harbor. After that, Dewey transported Emilio Aguinaldo, who was the Filipino leader. He was trying to organize a rebellion against Spanish rule, and Dewey transports Aguinaldo to the Philippines from where he was exiled in Hong Kong. And he's using Aguinaldo to rally Filipinos against the Spanish colonial government. So by June, only a month later, U.S. and Filipino forces had taken control of most of the Philippine islands. Aguinaldo proclaimed independence of the Philippines. However, some of the U.S. forces were not aware of the ceasefire that had been signed between Spain and the U.S. And continued to capture the city of Manila. And this battle really was important because it ended the Filipino-American collaboration. They no longer worked together because American forces prevented Filipino forces from entering Manila. And this was really hurt the feelings of the Filipinos. They deeply resented being shut out of Manila, and it later led to the Philippine-American War, which we'll talk about in the next series of videos. Also, the U.S. did not give the Filipinos their independence until much later, after World War II. So they did give Cuba their independence, but not the Filipinos. So some of the Americans looking at what's going on in both the Philippines and Cuba disagree with the fighting on moral and economic grounds. And there's the formation of the Anti-Imperialist League, which strongly opposes the Spanish-American War. And it is made up of people like Andrew Carnegie and Jane Addams and other well-known leaders. And so we start to see anti-imperialistic feelings emerge, and also some other countries voicing their disapproval of the United States and their actions. So at the end of 1898, the Treaty of Paris is signed in the city of Paris, obviously, and Puerto Rico becomes a U.S. territory as a result of this treaty. So this is kind of the agreement that the Spain and the United States come to. They give Cuba their independence, but they claim Puerto Rico as a U.S. territory. However, residents didn't become U.S. citizens until several years later. You can see there in 1917. Also, the U.S. bought the Philippines and Guam, and like I said, did not give the Philippines their independence, but rather claimed the Philippines as a U.S. territory. So in summary, the U.S. gained Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Also, in the Cuban Constitution, there are several amendments added. One is the Teller Amendment, which grants Cuba their independence. The second is the Platt Amendment, which gives the United States certain economic interests and also a naval base in Cuba, and that naval base is still there today, despite all the tensions that the United States has with Cuba. In terms of the war in the Philippines, that war pretty much continues as the Philippine-American War. Like I said, the Filipinos very much resented the U.S. taking over the Philippines and squashing the Filipino fight for independence. The war is, of course, suppressed by the U.S. military and makes William Taft the first governor of the Philippines. And I'll talk about this more in the next series of videos. And, of course, Philippines does not become independent until after World War II. The Philippine-American War was a much bloodier and more costly war than the Spanish-American War. I apologize for the length of that video, but that is the end of the Spanish-American War, and that is the end of this video series, so I look forward to seeing you in class.